Welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And guess where I am? I'm down in Washington, D.C. Pretty excited. Tomorrow, going to be at the second UAP hearing. Hopefully, I'll get in the door. It's a little chillier than it was back in July 26, 2023. So, Randall Nickerson, who I had dinner with tonight, and we came from the airport together, is actually staying overnight there at the door to make sure that he gets in early. I'm going to go there probably 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning myself to make sure I get in this time. It seems like there's a lot more people interested in getting there early. And maybe I said it too many times that I got there real early just to get in the door last time, because there's limited seating, only 30 seats or so. Anyway, our blog this week is a continuation of last week's, the Cash Landrum case, and it's part 2. So check that out. Podcastufo.com. We do have our merchandise there and our t-shirts, and they're just slightly over cost to cover expenses. So it's not like a moneymaker. They're a good deal is what I'm trying to say. So check out Podcast UFO t-shirts and other merchandise over on our website. And I'm excited to talk first with Kevin Wright. He's with the advocacy group here right outside the city in Washington. And after that, I have a wonderful guest who I've known for a long time, but am going to be talking to for the first time on this show, Laird Scranton. He's going to be talking about ancient UFO symbology and a lot more. But for right now, I'd like to bring in our guest, Kevin, and talk about tomorrow. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for having me.
Yes, you were on, I think you were on shortly after we met last year. I mean, yeah, a year ago, July.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Lots happened. I'm excited about tomorrow, and there's something going on I'm going to attend right after that too. But first of all, I know the lineup, but I don't have them right here in front of me. I know who's going to be there. But anyway, let's talk about the guests as we know them. As right now, I know it's Tim Gallaudet, who's been on the show, and Lou Elizondo, of course, who's been on the show, and 2 more. We got Schoenberger. Who's the third one from NASA?
Mark Gold.
4th one. Yeah,
Mark Gold. So he's been with NASA. He was also with some of the other projects going on with Bigelow and stuff. So it's hard to tell exactly what he's going to reveal or talk about. His the submitted statement that he's given to Congress has some inkling of suggestion of what he might be talking about, which is more scientific study and funding for the study of UAP, possibly through NASA or maybe a public-private enterprise or something like that. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what he's going to testify to.
I also saw, I believe it's Representative Nancy Mace was plugging this thing happening tomorrow. Like, she's really excited to talk about this. I thought she asked, along with a lot of other people, and this is a bipartisan. I have to say this because there is so much turmoil in this country about politics. This is a bipartisan issue, and that's what I think is wonderful. It's like you see AOC right in the same room talking nicely with Matt Gaetz, which is kind of unheard of anywhere else about any other topic that goes on in Washington. So, this will be exciting to see again.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's one of the very few, if not one of the only issues where there seems to be common ground between both parties, between the Democrats and the Republicans. Like you said, the fact that you could have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Matt Gaetz, in the same hearing and, not throwing, verbal jabs at one another or something. But I think there's obviously a lot of common cause here that cuts across party lines, which is the fact that, it's about government transparency. It's about corruption. It's about constitutional checks and balances between, in this particular case, between the legislative and the executive, where, all of the evidence points to the fact that there are agencies and departments of the executive branch that have been hiding, information and data as it relates to non-human intelligence and crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs. It's not just been hidden from the public, but it's also been hidden from Congress. which sets up, essentially a constitutional crisis that's going to have to be rectified by Congress. And it's going to take probably, some work by the executive branch too, in some sort of, partnership in trying to find a solution to this answer, because, it's essentially a catch-22 that the government finds itself in, where, they have, been lying to the public and to Congress. They've been, spoon feeding the public misinformation and disinformation. And, at some point you have to ask yourself, how do you get out of, this conundrum that they've built for themselves? And it's just going to boil down to the fact that they're just going to have to come clean.
When I was flying here today, I was listening to Need to Know podcast with Ross Coldhart and Bryce Zabel, and they made a good point. They're saying that several presidents along the way have tried to get the information, actually outright asked if there's did Roswell really happen, like Jimmy Carter did. Not Jimmy Carter. Bill Clinton asked that question directly. I want to know. And I remember when I had Chris Mellon on my show back in 2015 or 16, whenever it was. I asked him a question because he was in that, in where he would know what a president has to be told. And he said that if they know and the president directly asks, then they will have to answer him. The problem is, though, he said, what if these things are in private entities without congressional oversight? Then everything's compartmentalized and no one needs to know, anything other than what they need to know. So I think that is what is probably going on. Otherwise, Bill Clinton would have known back when he asked.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, because if you read what Michael Schellenberger has provided to Congress and what he has written on Public and other things, it seems that there's an indication that the particular program that he's referencing, which is Immaculate Constellation, that it might be an actual unacknowledged special access program that's actually run by the White House. I don't know if that's true or not, or what the case may be. But if that's true, then it certainly brings up additional questions that need to be asked about exactly what's going on there. I'm sort of questioning that, because it just doesn't seem to jive with a lot of other things that people have said about how these things are being run. But I think you're right in terms of some of these programs being run out of private enterprise with defense contractors and that sort of thing. But what it really boils down to is the fact that like I wrote a column for Roswell Daily Record that came out this past Sunday, sort of making the case about how Trump could, sort of tackle this issue if he's serious about, rooting out some of the corruption and various things in what he calls the deep state. And the perfect way to do that would be to tackle the UAP issue, because it cuts across so many different mechanisms and power structures of government. And what he could actually do is, essentially invite Congress to investigate the executive branch, while at the same time he could, implement parts of the UAP Disclosure Act by executive authority or executive order, and sort of work together, which would also sort of extend the olive branch between, his executive branch and the legislative branch, and sort of work together to root out this corruption, these hidden power structures, that are existing, that are thwarting, regardless of whether it's a Democrat or Republican president, it's sort of thwarting their agendas. Because if, Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or whoever else has asked questions and been denied access to these programs, then we have a serious constitutional crisis, not just between the executive branch and the legislative branch, but also within the executive branch itself. So, it's going to take a lot of work, I think, between, having these hearings, but we're also going to have to do, pass some legislation. We might need a select committee. We might need, executive orders, executive authority, something along those lines. But, the hearings are great. It's going to move, continue to propel the situation forward in public discourse and inform members of Congress and their staff. But it's certainly, not the end, but it's certainly a good beginning.
Right. Thank you so much, Kevin. I know you have to go, and I really appreciate your time. And we'll see you tomorrow. I can't wait to see you again, and I'm sure we'll be standing in line, and then afterwards there's something going in a park right nearby. I'm going to be over there too as well, and I'll see you.
Yeah, that's
there.
right. It's going to be an event.
Quickly about that.
Yeah. So 30 minutes after the hearing ends, we're going to give people time to, mingle and mix about and whatnot. But then, people can just essentially walk out the door and walk down the street, South Capitol Street, and there's a park right nearby, and we're going to have an event that's going to be hosted by New Paradigm Institute and MUFON together to talk about the hearing and talk about steps forward, legislative process, getting people involved, in civic education and action. And we're going to have some guest speakers. Well, obviously, we'll have Danny Sheehan from NPI. We'll have Ron James and McDonald from MUFON. We're going to have, other guest speakers. Julia Mossbridge is going to speak, and, other people. It'll be an opportunity for, the press and the public to, engage with, these two sort of leading organizations who have been working on, disclosure for a long time. And it should be a great event. We encourage people to show up.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Great, Martin. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. All right. Take care. All right. So just to let everyone know, tomorrow I'm going to be capturing the stream that is, hopefully right there at the event. So please keep an eye on our YouTube channel. I'm going to probably do a lot of shorts live, hopefully if I can, right from the hearing itself. And so again, real excited about that. And I'll try to get a lot of footage like I did last time. If any of you watch any of the programs, the documentaries or anything else on last year's hearing where it shows, David Grush, David Fravor, and Ryan Graves, in the back you see a cell phone sticking up, and I've seen it everywhere. It's all over the world, and that's my camera. That's my phone. I'm going to try to not be so obvious this time if I do some filming. But anyway, it's time to bring in our guest tonight. Laird, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks. Thanks very much. I appreciate you inviting me on.
Yes, it was nice to finally meet you at the Exeter conference this year after all these years.
Yeah, that's a great event. I was really impressed. I was fortunate to be able to travel with Peter Robbins, who's a longtime friend of mine, and he's instrumental in that conference. So,
yeah, that's right. Yeah, he has been for years. Yeah, and that's in my neighborhood. That's 10, 15 minutes away from where I live. So,
that's terrific. That's terrific.
Yeah.
I love how the whole community turns out for that.
Oh my goodness, it was wonderful. Wonderful. So I really liked your talk. I really enjoyed your talk. Some of the talks I kind of listened to, but yours really grabbed me all the way through. And I just, because there's so many puzzles, and the one of like I know you can talk about a lot of different things, but, in particular, when you're talking about the symbology, the ancient, symbols, it's just fascinating to me. And so I have to ask you in the beginning, what made you decide to look into that particular topic?
Well, actually, I was introduced to, in the late 1990s, to an African tribe, a priestly African tribe called the Dogon, who from Mali in the northwest hump of Africa, by my wife. She had read a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark. And one of the chapters in that book talks about how this tribe knows some things they really ought not to know about science, about astronomy, given that they don't have access to any technology. So I thought, wow, wherever that goes is going to be interesting. Well, as it turns out, the tribe is an excellent entry point to a comparative study of ancient symbolic traditions, because the tribe has societal connections to three different major groups. They have civic practices that are like ancient Egypt. They have rituals like ancient Judaism, and they have a cosmology like Buddhism. And so they also have a societal imperative to preserve original forms. So the Dogon language and the Dogon cosmological drawings and their esoteric tradition are all sort of key entry points into how to understand this tradition.
Very interesting. Yeah, I've seen artifacts, in the appraisals that I do, the Dogon, carvings and things like that. But this is, but fascinating. You can get back to these ancient drawings. I think you covered a whole bunch of things like that. The ancient, cave paintings, things like that.
Yeah, the symbols go way back, and they're everywhere. These are Jung's archetype symbols, so they're found everywhere.
Right, everywhere, and that's curious alone. That they're all over the world. It's not just in a given area, and similar things, which kind of point to like either people had the same imagination or they were seeing something.
Well, actually, the sort of consensus perspective of the ancient traditions I work with is that in ancient times there was deliberate instruction conducted by a group of non-humans who thoroughly understood the science of how energy works. And this group formulated a civilizing plan for humanity that was very closely tagged to the symbolic cosmology that explains how the energy works. And so all of these different cultures benefited from a single course of study, you can say. And there are certain symbolic elements that are signatures of that course of study. It'd be as if you and I met each other at a math or at a cocktail party, didn't know each other, but realized we both had the same math teacher in high school in different years, and we both were familiar with all the same little formulas, little tricks, and little story problems, and so forth. We'd have those things in common, not because we'd ever spoken before, but because we had shared the same teacher.
Yeah. And, I say on this show a number of times that I feel that we don't give the ancients enough credit for having, the brain power that they had. And that's part of the answer to a lot of these things, of course, when it comes to maybe how something was engineered that we can't fathom. For instance, I was mentioning earlier that I listened to Bryce Zabel and Ross Coldhart on their podcast. I was just listening on the way down here, and they're basically, Ross is on his way to Egypt. And I know that my good friend Chris Lito, who was here in Washington with us last time, he's actually going to be with him, and they're doing some type of research or some type of guided tour through some areas where their artifacts were found. He was talking about these granite vessels that were so precise that had to be like, I don't know, 15,000 years old or something like that.
Yeah, these are at the before, very, very, very early times, dynastically in Egypt. My friend John Anthony West, the Egyptologist, and I examined some of those vases together in a museum presentation, and it's just remarkable. There's no consensus outlook on how they could have carved that hard a stone in such a precision way, carved out the inside of these vases.
It seems impossible.
Yeah, it seems impossible.
I mean, even today, when I see, I've seen some things, and it just makes me wonder how they do it today.
Right.
And today they have a really high pressure water that can cut stone and marble like butter. That's a whole different thing. For them to get in to do the interior, it doesn't even make any sense. But anyway, somehow that happened and was done, and somehow they had the technology to do that back then.
Right.
And I can't imagine that it would be done by hand for granite or whatever it is, the stone is so tough to actually, it'd be like a lifelong for one person, a whole entire life to work on something. They couldn't even get that far, I don't think. I don't know.
Right. Well, a lot of times what looks near impossible to us, or we have a difficult time explaining how a certain process was brought about. Like I remember reading back in the 1990s, conjecture about how did they manage to align the Great Pyramid so nearly perfectly to the cardinal points. And there's speculation about, they were sighting on particular stars and so forth. As it turns out, there's a very simple geometric process to accomplish those alignments. That is actually the first exercise taught to a Buddhist initiate. When they first joined up, they're required to memorize it. And it's not hard to do at all if you know what you're doing. So a lot of times what looks exotic technologically boils down to something that is actually just an intelligent, you might want to say, parlor trick.
About that. And so, what are some of the more interesting sites and things that you have researched?
Okay, I've written a series of 15 books on comparative cosmology and language. Basically, I've tried to move geographically from Africa to Egypt to India, Tibet, and China. Made a leap across to northern Scotland because, believe it or not, there are connections to Scotland. And then around 2600 BC, outward from Scotland, southward and westward. I've written about Polynesia. I've written a book that tracks how the symbolic tradition made its way from the Near East to Scotland through the Mediterranean, with connections to ancient Crete and to ancient Greece and places like that. All really interesting stuff, and there's far more aspects of it that are intriguing to write about than I'll ever actually get to. You wouldn't think that this connects to the study of UFOs, but in fact it does. You start to see it when you get into more complicated UFO cases like the Linda Cortile case. In the cosmology, I'll try to explain this. They're talking about processes of creation. And when they say that, they're really referring to four things at once. It's referring to how the universe forms, how matter forms, how biological life comes about, and how consciousness comes about. And for the Dogon priests, they say that those four processes are parallel processes. They all arise from the same dynamics of energy. And so to underscore that idea, they developed, or they're preserving, a system of symbols, a single progression of symbols that simultaneously apply to all four of those themes. So every symbol along that continuum has meaning for each of those four themes. That's one of the reasons why the symbolism gets complicated, is because if we're talking about, say, the shape of a hemisphere, if the discussion is about how matter forms, that hemisphere represents the expansion of mass. If we're talking about biological reproduction, the shape of the hemisphere represents the expanding womb of the woman. These are parallel stages in the processes, and the meanings are very closely related, but consequently, every symbol and every important word carries not just a single meaning, but a cluster of meanings. And when we start getting into UFO cases, we discover that those cases play out in terms of those clusters of meanings. For example, if we compare I've read thousands of cases with witnesses of UFO-related events. What they describe seeing and feeling, what they describe as actions that are happening around them, relate directly to attributes of the things that are happening around them. And that cluster of things all play out in terms of common phonetics in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language or in some of the other ancient languages. So, for example, a person describes a UFO as rising up, and they report it being a particular color. Then they describe it as moving away, and now suddenly it's a different color. Those concepts of rising up and of moving away are associated in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language with the same colors that the witness is reporting. And I have dozens and dozens of situations where that's true. We have a famous UFO case where a woman steps out onto her front porch and she sees three gray aliens who are not aware that she's there at first. When they become aware of her, they turn to leave, but when they do that, she doesn't see three gray aliens leave. She sees three deer leave. Well, in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, the word that means to depart in haste also means deer. So it seems as if there's a kind of telepathic translation going on, that what the non-humans or the humans are seeing or feeling or or interpreting is being transmitted to the other participant, only in a translated way, so that it's the same concept, but it plays out in terms of these clusters.
Very interesting. Do you think that, so do you think, this is just an opinion. Do you think that there can be knowledge gained in any steps, moving forward into discovering what these things might possibly be by kind of back engineering what you are looking into?
Yes, I'll try to explain to you how that is. Okay. Anybody who's familiar with creational energy concepts, quantum physics, atomic physics, they realize that the terminology that the scientists use to explain what's going on with energy repeatedly adopts words that really pertain to water. Electricity flows, monopoles of energy condense, energy from a black hole evaporates. These are water terms. The Dogon are telling us that water is actually an objective pattern for what happens with energy. And if we want to know what's going on with energy, we ought to pay attention to what happens to water. So one of the things that happens with water is that in very deep parts of the ocean, water self-differentiates into biological zones. The kind of plant life and animal life that prefers to live on the floor of the ocean, in a very deep ocean area, it can be very different from the kind that lives very close to the surface. And there are zones in between, each with its own unique set of life forms and set of circumstances, depending on what conditions do they like, how much sunlight do they need, and what temperature of water do they like, and what water pressure do they prefer, and things like that. So the Dogon are telling us that energy does the same thing, that as energy spins, it self-differentiates into 14 domains. And those domains, Einstein tells us that as energy spins, the pace of time slows down. Momentum, angular momentum, is associated with the formation of mass and with the slowing of the pace of time. If we look at a diagram of the electromagnetic spectrum, we notice that scientists divide it into 14 domains, and those domains are differentiated based on the frequency of the energy, which plays out in factors of 10. The Dogons say, and the Egyptians tell us that these energetic domains also play out in factors of 10 of the pace of time. So now the Egyptians actually give us some insight into what those domains are like. Those domains coincide with what Hinduism calls states of energy or levels states of consciousness, levels of consciousness. In fact, by doing the comparative studies, we can actually derive proper names for certain levels of consciousness in those domains. So the ancient Egyptian symbol that represents the domain that sits next to ours, from the ancient perspective, our domain of energy sits 10 steps up from the bottom of those 14 domains. So the domain that is immediately adjacent to ours is defined by the Egyptian glyph that represents the concept of a gateway. And the idea is that crossover between the domains is possible under certain conditions. If we hop in a submarine and travel into the very deepest part of the ocean where the pressure is very, very great, if our submarine doesn't collapse on us, we can safely move into the water by using an airlock. We can equalize the pressure inside our submarine with the pressure outside, and once those pressures are equalized, it's safe to move from one to the other. Well, the continuum of energy works the same way, that towards the middle of the cycle of the continuum of energy, you have domains where the time frames are similar, and at that point, it's theoretically possible for living intelligence to move from one of those domains into another domain.
Very interesting. Someone made a point here. Where is it? I'm just looking for it. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's just a point where, the human body is made up of something like 60% of water.
Right.
Uh, I don't know how that ties in with any of it, but still, that's interesting that so many things are based on, water is really something.
Right. It
And
is really something.
go ahead.
Okay. Well, a human cell is actually a good um, concept to think about in terms of trying to understand how the energies work. Because in a human biological cell, okay, both the scientists and the ancients are talking about energy being in these domains being superimposed or superposed with itself. In other words, we have things at different time frames occurring simultaneously with each other that all contribute to the life of the overall, the broader domain. You can think of imagine a jazz combo where every player in the combo has complete freedom to play whatever they want to, as long as it's in harmony with whatever the theme of the overall piece is that the group's playing. Well, that's the way that time and energy are represented to function. That there are two dynamics of time being described. One that is linear, which is what we typically experience, but pretty much everyone I know at some point in their life has had a strong sense that under certain circumstances, events happen simultaneously. They don't happen sequentially, or sometimes even that some people perceive events before they happen sequentially. Well, from the ancient perspective, that's possible because you have two modes of energy, two oscillations of energy that are operating. One is an ultra quick oscillation that operates at very nearly the speed of light. From our perspective, all events occur at once if we're looking at it in terms of that energy. But we have another oscillation of energy that happens at about 2% of the speed of light, and that's where that occurs linearly, and that's where sort of the events are sequenced. I'm a software guy, so I understand the idea of a data file where the data just goes in however it arrives, and you use indexes to put that data into sequence. And then when you're processing it, you pick the right index and you process it in the correct sequence that you want. That seems to be the way these two modes of time work. That the first mode is just like a CD. It's an amalgamation of a bunch of things that are discrete, but not in any particular sequence necessarily. Cassette tape is sequential. If you want to get to the third song on a cassette tape, you have to fast forward to it. If you want to get to the third song on a CD, you can just skip directly to the third song.
Interesting. Well, a lot of times people have, theorized that the way UFOs travel, kind of taking a little sidestep here, but is through time manipulation. And I just wondered if you ever considered, that any of that.
Yes, that these domains are the key to that as a possibility, because we don't have the ability to shift between those time differentiated domains. These are not dimensions. These are more, as I said, akin to the biological zones in water. If we're talking about domains of water, we have, the domain of water of the sea is comparable to what we think of as a dimension, and the domain of air is comparable to another dimension. But within the water, we have self-differentiated zones that are not dimensions as such. They're more like the stages of vibrations of energy in the electromagnetic spectrum. In a biological cell, we have reactions that occur at all sorts of different paces. And the components within a biological cell can only interact with other components that vibrate at the same pace they do. And when they interact, they produce a byproduct that then vibrates at a slower pace than they did. And that new byproduct can only interact with other components that vibrate at its pace. And so you have this sort of natural sequencing of chemical reactions that have to happen in a particular order, because the vibrations of the energy are dictating that. And those are all simultaneous. They're superposed with each other. that they're all going on simultaneously within a cell, but you can conceptualize the ones that vibrate at the same pace as existing in a different domain than the ones at a different pace.
Now, another little shift here. Just asking you, have you personally ever observed what you would consider a UFO?
No, I haven't had any direct experience myself with a UFO, but I've had, as any researcher in my field of study has had, I've had any number of, how can we say, synchronous experiences. I'd say that the first thing that a person in my field of study learns is that there are things going on in the world that we can't immediately explain. Some of them are very objective in that they've been witnessed by other people and can be attested to by people I know. Others are very subtle. Kabbalism defines many different categories of mystics based on how the people in these categories are able to interact with energetic influences. A medical psychic can interact with energetic information in ways that allow them sort of to intuitively sort out what a medical issue is for a person. There are all sorts of different ways that people connect to this stuff. I'm part of a pretty broad community of people who are connected in various ways. And we have interactions back and forth all the time. One of the things that happens, I told you how the symbolism I study relates directly to UFO cases that happen. It also relates directly to vivid dreams that people have. So quite often a person will send me a long description of what their vivid dream was and what they remember about it, what were the key events of the dream and who are the characters in it and what was said and what actions did they take and what images did they see, what colors were involved, things like that. I'll sort through that description of their dream and discover that all of the key elements of a given dream play out in terms of a single phonetic of these ancient languages I work with. And very typically there's one or more other phonetic values related to that same cluster of things that isn't represented in the dream, but we can see when we take the dream in its entirety that they describe the subject of what the dream was actually about. And even crazier, more and more, most often those dreams that people send me, just sort of unbidden, have a direct relationship to things that I'm actively researching or issues I've been trying to solve. Or I had one situation one summer and one July, I thought I was researching 6 different questions that related to Egyptian language for 6 different people I knew. And one morning, all 6 of those questions resolved in about the course of about an hour, but they resolved through words that all were found in a single column of a single page of the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary. And there was a 7th word in the same column that opened up an entire book's worth of information to me personally. I went on and over the next few months wrote an entire book based on what I was able to discern based on that one morning's work.
Isn't that something? Now, when you talk about these languages, a lot of times you hear of like a dead language or, I don't know what other terms are for it. They're just, not used anymore.
Right.
Is that kind of what you've been looking through, these type of things? And is this a written language?
In some cases, yes. Okay. The Dogon are of a mind with Socrates. Plato described what Socrates felt about written language. Socrates thought that he saw written language as a degradation of instruction. Socrates came at things from the mindset. You remember, for centuries and centuries, we would pass down skills from a master practitioner to an apprentice. And the apprentice would learn side by side with that master practitioner. And by the time 10 or 20 years had passed, the student was now as capable as the master had been, and the master's skill got passed down successfully from generation to generation. That's how the Dogon teach cosmology. So Socrates felt that a written text was a security breach waiting to happen, that a written text was a way for a person who didn't actually understand a subject to represent to other people that they did. The Dogon feel the same way. They've declined to adopt a written language. Everything they do is through spoken language. But in the system I'm working with, prior to around 500 BC, all of these ancient languages self-defined the meanings of their own words in various ways. For example, in the Dogon language, every syllable of the Dogon language represents what I call a root concept. And those root concepts are like building blocks for other concepts. And so I can take any given Dogon word that, if it's a complicated word, I can break it down into its syllables, and I know what those syllables represent, or I can go find out what they represent. And it works sort of like a child's rebus puzzle, where you substitute the word I, meaning me, for a picture of an eye, or you substitute the concept of being or existence for a picture of a flying bee. You do the same thing with these syllables. You substitute concepts for syllables, and now suddenly the way the word is pronounced produces a sentence that explains what the intended meaning of the word was. The Egyptian hieroglyphs work the same way. The Egyptologists don't understand this. In China, they do, because that's the traditional way Chinese words are read. But with an ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic word, a simple example is a word for week that was written with two glyphs. The sun glyph, which is a circle with a dot in the middle of it, it can represent the concept of a day, and an upside down U, which is the number 10. So I looked at that word and I thought to myself, symbolically, that word says 10 days. What I didn't realize was the ancient Egyptians had observed a 10-day week. The form of the word communicated to me correct knowledge about the concept of an Egyptian week, and I didn't know anything about Egyptian week. It turns out the ancient Chinese word for week was formulated exactly the same way, and they also observed a 10-day week. Any symbolic element that was original to these traditions comes with an aspect of self-confirmation of its own meaning. That's one of the ways you can recognize that it's original to the tradition, is because it has that self-confirmation aspect to it. And so, for example, we have a traditional shrine in India called a stupa. And the Dogon tribe preserved what I have long thought was an archaic form of a stupa shrine. It's constructed on the same geometric set of shapes. It shares a lot of the same symbolism, and it holds the same place as a grand symbol in regard to the whole cosmology. Well, this Dogon shrine rests on a base that's circular, and it rises to a square roof. The square roof measures 8 cubits by 8 cubits, so that's 64 square cubits. The circular base has a diameter of 10 cubits, so if we apply 3.2 as a rounded value of pi, it has a circumference of 64 cubits. Those two numbers confirm each other. Once we realize that, we understand that the Dogon shrine is the original form because it retains that aspect of self-confirmation of meaning, whereas Buddhist stupa doesn't. And you can do that with all of the language, all the terms. Part of what I strive to do in my books is to trace back what the original word was for a thing, because if you can get to that word, I don't have to guess what they were talking about. The form of the word will explain to me what the scribe who wrote the word meant.
Interesting. We have a bunch of questions that came in. This is just a statement here, but it was such a disaster when the Alexandria Library burned. I can't remember. It was a few thousand years ago, or whatever. Whenever it was,
right?
There was a vast lot of knowledge that, of course, could never be replaced.
Yes, a great deal of knowledge was lost. What isn't said is that in various cultures, in Mali, in India, in Egypt, and other places like that, libraries like that exist, hidden libraries, secret libraries that are overseen by caretakers and scribes whose whole job it is to perpetually copy the oldest of the texts and faithfully copy them to a new copy so that the text is preserved.
Right.
I know people who've offered to take me into those kinds of libraries. I've spoken with people who dedicated time and over the past few decades to trying to preserve those. There's a famous South African astronomer named Thebe Mudepe who's made it his mission to preserve those libraries. So yes, a great deal of knowledge was lost when the Library of Alexandria burned, but that's the tip of an iceberg. There are all sorts of similar libraries that exist unknown to the rest of us in these ancient cultures.
Right. Quite interesting. So I'm just going to pop up a few other questions here. Do you think that our DNA stores memories of experience and or communicates with other DNA and other cells? That's interesting.
Well, there's a lot about DNA they don't know, and the dynamics of how DNA forms conform to the cluster of energetics that I write about. DNA has the capacity to store information very, very, very efficiently. As a matter of fact, there are scientists working on trying to develop computers where the mode of storage is DNA. And it has the capacity to store it for very long periods of time, to hold it for very long periods of time. So I think it's perfectly likely that knowledge is stored in DNA. I know that the junk DNA, what's called the junk DNA, distributes itself statistically in a pattern that's identical to how any written text distributes itself, that the most common word occurs X number of times, and the second most common word occurs the next most number of times, and so forth. DNA distributes itself like language. So there's every reason to think that junk DNA is language. I'm imagining that as a software designer, I know that when I wrote a software program, I would devote as much effort to the comments that explained what was about to happen in the next section of computer code I was about to write as anything else. And so I imagine that DNA works the same way, that if a competent programmer was behind the organization of aspects of the DNA, they would have wanted to document what they were doing. Not necessarily for the benefit of somebody else. Oftentimes, I was the person who benefited from my own comment, because 5 years later, I was asked to pick up a program I had written 5 years before, and I had to get back into the mindset of how does this program work and what's it doing. And those comments were invaluable to figuring that out. Now, whether or not communication can happen between DNA of different creatures, that's hard to say. The sort of currency of energetic exchanges is photons. There's a reason for that. It's because photons naturally form from the interaction of magnetism and electricity. They're a form of something that science calls a beat frequency. You'll be familiar with what a beat frequency is. If you've ever driven your car on a highway and opened just one window, you likely heard a whacka, 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 whacka sound. And that whacka sound is a beat frequency. It comes about because when you have two waves of energy that are moving closely into and out of phase with each other, at certain points, the two waves multiply each other, and so you get a louder sound when it's in a range that is audible. At other points, they interfere with each other, and so they get a very quiet sound, and so you end up with a sound that grows from very quiet to very loud and back again repeatedly, again and again and again and again. That's how energy works. It's even true, it looks as if, Louis de Broglie was a French physicist in the 1920s and 30s. And in 1927, he wrote a very important paper where he demonstrated mathematically that in a hydrogen atom, the stable orbits of an electron, there are 3 to 5 stable orbits, orbital distances for an electron in a hydrogen atom. Those correspond to points of resonance for the two energies. Those stable orbits have all the same attributes as a beat frequency. It's as if those were the initial beat frequencies that are produced through the energies of a hydrogen atom, and then they facilitate the creation of the photons, which are the same dynamic of energy. When the energy reaches a certain point, it can be exchanged outward or it can be accepted inward, and that's all done through photons. So because energy can be exchanged through photons, I don't have proof that DNA isn't capable of receiving or sending that kind of energy. It might be able to.
Oh, wow. Okay. Here's another question here. Let me just put it up here. Can you provide any references to specific examples of UFOs displaying the same colors while performing the same actions?
Off the top of my head, I don't have the relationship of the colors to the motions there. If you read the Linda Corteil story and what the witnesses said happened with the UFO device, that as it moves away, you're getting the equivalent of redshift. So I know it turns red as it moves away, and it seems to turn blue as it approaches you. But you have other colors as it rises up and as it descends. And those colors are associated properly with what the ancient languages phonetics associate. So, but it goes beyond that. It also goes to emotions that people experience, that we're talking about these domains of energy. When you cross over the boundary between the materialized domain and the non-material or the energetic domain, there's an emotion of love that is evoked at the time of that crossing. When you cross the other direction, there's an emotion of sadness or tearfulness that's evoked. And so anytime you had a person who's had a paranormal or a spiritualized experience, an energetic experience where they're expressing it in terms of deep feelings of love or deep feelings of sadness, you can pretty much say conceptually what direction across that boundary between non-materiality and materiality the experience moved them in one way or another. There are also time differences, all the ancient discussions of fairy folk who were sometimes material forms and sometimes they weren't. It's like they were sitting at the boundary between materiality and non-materiality. There were time differences between those zones. Rip Van Winkle, who his Washington Irving's father was actually from Orkney in Scotland, which is one of the places I've studied. Rip Van Winkle, when he returns from being taken by the fairy folk, has aged dramatically. We saw with Travis Walton that he thought he'd been away for a few hours, but in our frame of reference time-wise, he'd been gone for days.
Right.
The very common experience with UFO experiences that they describe being away for a short period of time, but they come back and discover they were actually gone for a longer period. They were missed for a longer period than that.
Yeah, he actually had a beard growth, and he couldn't even believe it when he
Right.
touched his. Yeah, very interesting. Can you believe this time went by so fast? So where can someone reach you, Laird?
Okay, well, you can find me on Facebook. I say don't confuse me with all the other Laird Scrantons. I'm the only Laird Scranton there. If you friend me there, I'll accept your request and we can Facebook message, or if need be, we can communicate by email. I have no problem with my email address being given out. The one I work from is scrantonlr@aol.com. Scranton like Pennsylvania, LR as the letters. at AOL.com. Feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions or to be a sounding board for some kind of experience that people have. My books are available at simonandschuster.com, or they're all available on amazon.com. Over the years, to begin with, my books were traditionally published. But over the years, it's taking longer and longer to get a book published. You submit a manuscript, and 18 months later, you have a finished book. I discovered I could self-publish a second book during those intervening months. So for 4 years, I was publishing 2 books a year. I was publishing one traditionally and one self-publishing. Now I'm to the point where it's just simpler overall, and I have better control over what I get if I self-publish the book.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. This has been a lot of fun. It's been a pleasure meeting you at the conference, and I'm happy to have done this and been a part of your earlier interview.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Yeah. All right, everyone. So we'll be back next week with Eric Mintel, and remember to keep your eyes on our Facebook and YouTube channel tomorrow during the hearing. And also, hopefully that hearing will be live tomorrow. Thanks so much, everyone. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky.